I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access. There weren't many female sports writers when Melissa Isaacson broke into the business in the early 1980s. That wasn't going to stop her. Melissa's determination and journalistic skills helped carve out a path for others and made her a trusted and respected scribe for nearly 35 years. Along the way, she covered big moments of major sporting events around the nation and the world. And back in Sweet Home Chicago, she chronicled a dynasty. You know, the Bulls of the 1990s. Michael Jordan, yeah, that guy, and that team. Melissa has some great stories about being on the front lines with those Bulls, as well as some other moments from her stellar career. Hey, Melissa, I really appreciate you joining us on Press Box Access.
Thanks for having me, Todd.
Well, it's quite an honor. You were in the sports writing game for more than 30 years, 19 of them at the Chicago Tribune, and I always respected your work from afar. I think we kind of ran in a parallel universe. I would see you at events, but we never really got to cross paths, personally, so it's great to chat with you about your career. I do know that when I left sports writing, I had to go into one of those astronaut rooms for a few days to decompress because it was so different. I don't know, what's it been like for you since you got out of the daily grind?
That's funny. I did miss it more than I thought I would. And I don't know, there's different, waves, I guess, of I don't want to call it mourning, but, of leaving the profession on a daily basis. I certainly didn't miss, let's start with the negative. I certainly didn't miss standing around empty locker rooms, waiting for players to come in that didn't want to talk to us, who didn't want anything to do with us, frankly. In the last several years, the access got worse and it just became sort of this endless waiting around and feeling like it was very difficult to really engage. And so that part I don't, but I think what happens is you remember the good times, you remember sort of the moments when you did have, engaged with athletes and really did do meaningful stories and sat down at your computer. I still have moments, although I still write, when I just badly miss writing, badly miss it. It could be a big game. It could be anything from, a big game to watching it and saying like, gosh, I wish I was writing it. Watching Wimbledon and thinking like I covered probably 20 of them. Wow, I wish I was there. This is what I would say. Maybe even thinking of a lead occasionally, just crazy stuff like that. And still teaching journalism, obviously, writing is always, in front of, my mind. So there's that. And then, of course, just missing the gang. I mean, the lifestyle itself got harder and harder. And I'm sure now is even harder than ever with canceled flights and, and just everything that 2022 presents in terms of traveling. We used to be able to kind of run for flights at the last second for much of my career. Not all of it. Don't miss social media, but do miss the immediacy of it. Do miss thinking like a reporter and being in the thick of it. Being in the thick of it, I think, is what we all love.
Right.
Just being super curious and having that credential to allow you to be in the middle of stories. So whether I'm watching a news story unfold on television or a sports event, it will never leave me that I'm a reporter. I will never not call myself a reporter. And so there are times when when I'm sad about that.
Well, you didn't leave the business altogether. You're a respected author, and you're a faculty member at Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, as good as it gets out there. And I'm sure the students are being well taught the craft by you. And I want to start with something, though, that I think you were also a teacher back when you were covering the Chicago Bulls dynasty in the 1990s. There was a moment, and I've done my research now, when you taught Ron Harper and B.J. Armstrong.
Oh.
You know what I'm getting to?
Yeah. That's funny.
All right, well, let's set the scene. It's Richfield Coliseum outside of Cleveland. It's before a game between the Bulls and the Cavs. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, I remember this very well, but I'm a little scared that if I checked with BJ and Ron, they'd be like, what are you talking about? But like, I remember it very well. And maybe it was definitely BJ, and I think it was Ron. We were talking about, I was very pregnant. I should set the stage with that. I was very, very pregnant at the time. Probably the last moment that the airlines let me travel, maybe 7-8 months, probably into the 8th month. And I was, you could not talk about children and pregnancy when you're walking around that big. And frankly, athletes like to talk about that. I talked more to Michael Jordan about my pregnancy than anything else probably. And that happened with a lot of athletes. It was somewhat of a refreshing change for me, I guess, if you will. So BJ was at the time a single guy. He had a serious girlfriend, and somehow we got to talking about childbirth, and he was like, wanted none of it. He was just, ew, gross. I'm not going to be near the place. I'm not going to be at the delivery. It's so icky and blah, blah, blah. Not sure he said the word icky. I'm making that up. But, it's just gross. And so Ron, as I recall, chimed in. It's like, no, it's not. It's Lamaze. It's all breathing, right, Melissa? And then pretty soon we're talking very serious Lamaze. And 1, 2, 3. Next thing we know, we've got BJ on the training table and with the basketball serving as the baby and talking him through it to try to explain how easy it was. As I recall, it was very serious conversation. Very like. As if we were in a real Lamaze class, teaching, guiding him through the breathing. Ron Harper's talking to him very seriously about how to breathe. He's got his legs in the imaginary stirrups. No one's like laughing. It's not they're not belittling the process. And I'm coaching. And so we go through the whole thing and Ron's explaining and the ball, and then the baby's born. And then at precisely that moment, Phil Jackson walks into the room. And mind you, this is a playoff, scenario. And he walked, as I recall, a few steps in and just in his droll sort of way, looked at us and just shook his head and turned and walked out. And it was with a look that was like both like, you better get out of here, Melissa, like in 2 seconds. When I turn around again, like you better be gone. But also like, what is going on? I have nothing to say. I mean, so yeah, I quickly, got my gear and vamoosed. But it was memorable. It was one of the memorable pregnancy moments.
Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is what it was like to be a sports writer back in the day.
Yeah, that's it. That's what I miss. Yeah, that's what I miss.
All right, we're going to talk a lot about those Bulls teams and Michael Jordan, that guy Jordan, heard a little bit about him.
Yeah.
Because you covered that dynasty run of 6 NBA championships. But, you witnessed and wrote about so much more in your career at the Tribune, at ESPN, Orlando Sentinel, USA Today. Besides the Bulls, when you think about certain moments or memories or anecdotes or behind-the-scenes things that linger in your memory, what comes to mind when you think about your career in totality?
Well, those Bulls days certainly were special. And I think, people always want to know, like, when you were going through it, was it that cool? Was it that special? And I do remember taking stock of it. And I do remember fully appreciating, like, you can't have perspective. You can't be like, well, 20 years from now or 30 years from now, I'll look back and think this is the greatest moment of my career. But I certainly was cognizant of how special it was and that it may very well be a highlight of my career and that I was watching at that time and I thought forevermore, and some would argue still the greatest basketball player who ever lived in his prime on an almost nightly basis. And so that was not lost on me at all. And, being able to, again, have that access, have that front row seat, see it close up, and more than that, describe it to an audience that didn't get to, didn't all get to get tickets to, Chicago Stadium and the United Center. Couldn't afford it or couldn't get them. And so because of the lack of social media, I think it was a real luxury for us writers to have that responsibility to really describe in full. Yes, they saw it on television, but there was so much behind the scenes that we could bring to our stories, and not just because of the immediacy of social media. And I'm not saying social media is terrible or anything like that. All I'm saying is that it allowed us the luxury to sit back and witness it, and sit back and really gather our thoughts to some degree. Certainly we were on deadline. But to ask thoughtful questions and to listen to their answers without being nervous that we were having to tweet and having to beat the next guy.
Right.
So yes, we were concerned with beating people, but we could ask, more questions. We could report more fully, be more sure of ourselves before we reported the next morning. And then, the downside obviously is you had to live with it for a whole day. But when we were really in the peak of covering the Bulls, and certainly, I covered the Bears, and it was just it was just all Chicago, even with the Cubs and the Sox. Mm-hmm. You could count on this level of interest. I guess that's my point.
Right.
This great level of scrutiny and interest that just made our job so fun.
Right.
And so demanding, but so fun.
You mentioned taking the reader someplace that they couldn't go, right? And,
yeah.
And we'll talk more specifically about the Bulls, but you also traveled the world, and you went to Wimbledon, and you went, like you said, 20 times or so. You went to the British Open, Olympics. Was that your approach, even when you weren't doing the daily beat stuff, was to try to take somebody along with you?
For sure. Oh, absolutely. It was so much fun. I mean, you didn't want to make it. I was very cognizant of I'm not going to go to Wimbledon the first time and just do nothing but wax poetic about the strawberries and cream as if I'm the first person who's ever been to Wimbledon before.
Mm-hmm, right.
You have to sort of realize that people have been watching forever, and maybe people have been or whatever, and you don't want to act like too much of an amateur. But at the same time, that sense of wonder of being there and being next to the royal box, and, again, back in the day, the royal box was right next to the press box. And there was, Princess Diana.
A little different food in those two boxes, by the way.
Yeah, a little bit. Princess Diana was like a spit away, and we didn't spit. But, she really was. And we were all just fascinated with her and watching her every second. So you better believe I was going to bring that to people. And I did do a strawberries and cream story. I just tried not to act like I was the first person who walked on the moon and did it. But,
mm-hmm.
I remember going to tracing the strawberries from the farm to the royal box, because only the very select ones went to the royal box, and fun stuff like that. But yeah, Bears fans, when we played, when the Bears played rather in Ireland, that was certainly a cool experience, and got to do 4 or 5 Olympics, and that was very cool, and certainly, wanted in every way, just like at the Chicago Stadium, to make people feel they were there. I think that's sort of the responsibility of writers everywhere to heighten that reading experience, because again, they could, especially the Olympics. I mean, that's a TV show. That's the greatest TV show ever. You could be watching it. So what are we going to do to make you feel like you were there behind the scenes? And that's tough. I think the Olympics is the toughest one to do that as a writer.
Give us an example of an Olympic moment where you were able to do that, and you recall, you were able to get away from just a typical game story, for say.
Yeah. I think my first Olympics ever, and I'm going to forget his name, but the swimmer from a country that, if I guess I'll get it wrong, but he was one of those countries that it didn't, there was one delegate from the whole country. He didn't have a Olympic-sized pool to train in. He trained in a little teeny hotel pool. I'd have to swim back and forth 1 billion times. Mm-hmm. He ran around the small village to get in shape. He was in no means Olympic, world-class level. And so he came in last, and he came in, maybe I could swim faster. I'm not sure. Probably not. But and so I remember meeting him, back in the day. This is probably Australia in 2000, because it was before the really heightened security, where I just sort of met him. I just sort of went to the Olympic Village and sat down with him. I remember sitting on a bench, and no one cared, and just, really, really talking about it, and describing his training and describing the whole thing. And maybe that was a guy everybody did stories on. I don't remember, but I remember having a one-on-one, because there was a few athletes that would fit that description. Right. Sorry, I don't have his name. But But I do remember having a one-on-one with them, and that was not uncommon pre 9/11.
Right. Security is so much more lax than those days. I mean,
yeah. I mean, my husband. If you were in Sydney, you probably remember. My husband came. Well, you don't remember my husband, but he came. He came to visit the last several days, and the women's U.S. Olympic basketball team was playing a gold medal game. And you know how people always joke, like, "Can I just, go in your suitcase and can I carry your bags and stuff like that?"
Yeah,
and you're like, "Sure, okay." It was pre 9/11. Also, it was Australia, the friendliest, g'day mate people in the world. And so my husband literally just carried some of my stuff and walked behind me with no credential, and they just waved him through. Wow. And he walked right on in and watched the gold medal game. I'll never forget that. And he was not even, devious. Like in these days, if you tried that, you'd be arrested. Right. I mean, he was just like, "Hi,"
Did he write a sidebar for you, Melissa?
He did. He did not write a sidebar, but he did eat the pressed food, as I recall.
Yeah. So then he was a sports writer.
Yeah, so he did. He did some of his responsibilities. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I think about with your career is you started in 1983 when you first graduated from the University of Iowa. And at the time, there weren't many women sports writers, And so what was it like for you breaking in as a female in a business that had a bunch of old, mostly white guys?
It was lonely in terms of not having a lot of women, but in my college paper, there were 2 women, actually, so I shouldn't even say that. There was a lot of scrutiny. One of the women went only by initials in her byline.
Really?
If she's listening, H. Forrest Woolard was her byline, and her first name was Holly. I admired her and Heidi McNeil, our sports editor, greatly, but I didn't know that Holly Woolard was a woman because it was H. Forrest. And I don't think I ever even talked to her about why she did it. I can only surmise that she wanted to blend in and not be, And so at that time, I remember reading her and, thinking she was great, and reading Heidi and wanting to be just like her. But also reading articles in the New Yorker magazine at that time. There was a big article about all the women who were getting out of sports writing. They were maybe 30, and they were just clearly there was no place for them. There was all kinds of horror stories about not being allowed in the press box and being too old for the game. And I remember vividly reading this in the college library at Iowa and thinking like, wow, there is no place for me. I what am I getting myself into? And then I went into the newsroom and I met Holly and realized she was a woman and thought, well, she's got to hide her identity. So what in the world am I really getting into? But I immediately loved it so much that there was no question. I adored writing and I adored sports, and we had unbelievably colorful, coaches, Hayden Fry back then, and Lute Olson was the basketball coach. And so it was, the football team was going to the Rose Bowl and the basketball team was going to the Final Four with Ronnie Lester. And so, my God, if you can't get excited about that. But it was clear, I didn't hit a real roadblock at that point. That would come later, being told that you're a woman, get out. People were very nice.
Were you in the locker room when Joan Ryan had the incident at the USFL? Because Joan was a guest on our show, and she recounted that incident, and I think I heard that you might have been present, too.
Joan was at the Orlando Sentinel, and I was at Florida Today, the smaller paper in Cocoa, Florida. So, yeah, I was the one cowering at the door while Joan was in getting harassed by the Birmingham Stallions. And the way my perspective is that I was looking around for help, literally, because I could see everyone crowded around her, and I could see someone crouching next to her and like doing something to her leg, which later I found out was a tape cutter was, up and down of her leg, and just just really horrible. Harassing her. Right. And when I saw the nearest guy with like a red polo shirt, I still remember the red polo shirt and, looking like a team official, I thought, well, I'll kind of alert him, and later found out that was Jerry Sklar, the team owner. And he was joining in on the whole proceeding. So he was not to be somebody who would help. And Joan wrote an amazingly powerful column the next day, and I watched Joan in awe. And I wrote a column as well for the smaller, Florida Today paper. But Joan took, more of the scrutiny,
Melissa, how did you deal with the shit that you had to deal with at times, especially earlier in your career?
Yeah. I think the the credo, if you will, for all of us was just to blend in. There was fear that if you complained, if you made too much of a big deal out of it, we were not going to have a sympathetic audience by any stretch of the imagination. Even if you had a nice editor, there was going to be some of our editors who weren't going to look kindly to us complaining, and certainly our readers didn't care at all, didn't want to hear that. We're in this wonderfully privileged position of being able to cover games. So we're very, very conscious of the fact that no one wanted to hear. And I personally, I won't speak for everyone, felt like if I ever said anything, or if anybody did, we would get drummed out of the business. And certainly we saw what happened to Lisa Olson, who felt like she had to leave the business. And that was very scary. She's younger than me. But there was very much of a just please God, let no one throw me out of the locker room feeling. And there were many times when in football locker rooms, players would single me out and other women and say, if she's here, I'm not talking. And then the other guys would kind of look at you like, can you either meanly get out or nicely, like I'll give you quotes, can you just get out? And so I'm not sure when it happened, maybe early 90s is when the tide sort of shifted to if any player ever said that, I could feel pretty confident that my male colleague would turn and say to the athlete, no, if she goes, we go kind of thing. Right. If not quite that strongly, then certainly that feeling that you had that everybody was behind you and there were more women joining you. But more often than not, you were the only woman in the locker room. Throughout the 80s, I think, if I saw another woman, it was a big deal.
Right. I mean, you think about it, your career started, it wasn't that much longer, maybe a decade, 10 years or so after Title IX, which changed women athletics. And so the scene just wasn't accepted of women at the time in sports writing. It just wasn't. And I feel like the courage and the trailblazing that you and others did is something that shouldn't be forgotten because you had to deal with a hell of a lot more than somebody like me who started in '88 and just walked in and felt comfortable.
Well, certainly the pioneers, came before us. Now I'm blanking on everybody's names. The Michelle Himmelbergs, Melissa Lutke's, they were unbelievable women, worked in the 70s. And those are the ones I read about in the New Yorker some of them were leaving the business, but some were digging their heels in. And even those who left the business had paved the way for us. So in no way do I want to leave the impression that the early 80s was the worst for women sports writers. There was already, the foundation was laid in for us. And Mary, why am I forgetting her name? Was it Olson? Gerber, one of the very first. Gerber. Yeah, she was tremendous, before us. And in Chicago, Jeannie Morris was covering the Bears. And so there were always women before us who fought the good fights. And so for us, I think it was just, let's just follow along, keep our head down, do our work. I wasn't ashamed that I wasn't, bringing up every complaint. There were times when I thought, well, maybe I should have for the women to come. If I would say like, this guy's a bad dude or this happened to me. Joan and I raised it, certainly made it public what happened with that situation. Mm-hmm. I'd like to think I would have, if something really, truly horrible happened, I certainly would have said something. But I think, our motto, and there were so many good, and there are still, but so many great sports writers to come out of those 80s and 90s, because we really did know that we had to be really good. You had to be better. You had to be better than the average guy. At least I thought that way. At least I felt that way, that, and everywhere I looked, there were women like Jeanette Howard that were so good. And Diane Pewson and, Christine Brennan and on, that were just wonderful. And of course, Sally Jenkins, that were doing tremendous work across the country. And so, it was very Lean Voisin, the NBA. So it was very easy to look at others and just say, okay, they're just doing great work. Let me just keep up,
Yeah, let the work speak for itself and make your way that way,
Right,
but
absolutely.
you had to deal with, I do find it amazing that the things that the women had to deal with in those years. And it did start to change, in the early 90s. It started to becoming a little more welcoming. And I think that's around the time when you started covering the Bulls as a beat. And I brought up Title IX before because you actually played basketball. I mean, you wrote a great book about it called State, A Team, a Triumph, a Transformation, which is about the high school basketball team that won the 79 state championship and about the years of Title IX and being an athlete. And so you did know the game too. I mean, you by the way, what position did you play?
Oh gosh, I was a little point guard. I was lucky they let me on the court 5'2". I think I said 5'2.5" maybe in the program. But, yeah, I was not destined for big things. I was not destined for the Olympic team. Let's put it that way. Even though I wanted to be, I wanted desperately to be on the Olympic team.
Science, science, science! Science, science! Hello, podcast fans. Want to get weird with us? Come check out the Mad Scientist Podcast. We're a weekly show that looks at the history, philosophy, and hard facts behind your biggest paranormal questions.
Did the government really pay for a psychic spy program?
Yes!
Is it true that surgery got its start in grave robbing?
Yes!
Can a roller coaster really kill you?
Legally, we can't say so for sure, but sometimes, yes! Join myself, Chris Cogswell, and my co-host, Marie Mayhew, as we examine the science, philosophy, and history behind the strange and unusual. All to discover what's possible and plausible versus what's, well, just made up. Check us out wherever you find your favorite podcasts. The Mad Scientist Podcast.
So you played basketball. You played for a state championship high school team.
Yeah.
And you got about a career of sports writing under your belt. And now you go into Chicago Stadium in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And put us inside that old barn. The smoke, the heat. What was the atmosphere like in that place when his airness was flying around at the start of that dynasty?
Oh, my gosh. Well, I wrote, my first book was on Michael Jordan's transition to baseball, but I spent at least 2 chapters just on the stadium. One on the entrance the media was entered, which is called Gate 3.5, which continued just symbolically after that. But it really was, again, this little Gate 3.5 thing. But I wrote in detail about that place, and it was to call it charming would really be overselling it. There was certainly a charm to it. But if you want to call rats charming,
right.
Then okay. In those days, the home locker room was worse than any visiting locker room that you could. I mean, nowadays for sure, the visiting locker room's beautiful now. But back in the day when they started like revamping stadiums, the visiting would be terrible and the home would be pretty nice. Chicago Stadium, I mean, they was lucky if they had a hook for their clothes and not a nail, certainly in Richmond Coliseum was like that. In Detroit, the Palace was like that. In Boston, all the old barns were like that. But it gave a certain intimacy, a certain, Michael couldn't hide. They couldn't hide from us. There was no, in visiting locker rooms particular, like I was describing with BJ and Ron Harper, the visiting locker rooms in those days had a training table right in the middle of the visiting locker room. And so guys had to be wrapped, and they couldn't escape us. We could talk to them while they were getting their ankles taped and stuff like that. So that was cool. But, it was smoky. Like the stadium, they didn't, smoking was allowed. So the cloud of smoke would rise, though, and there'd be a ring, and it would be right where the press box was, of course, right? So we were
exactly right.
It was right there. But we also were on the floor. The beat writers got floor access, so that was good. I'm trying to think. I feel like the stadium, though, we were always up in that teeny tiny little shaky little press box that when the roar of the crowd happened, it would shake. The press box would shake. You feel like maybe it might come down.
Yeah.
It was that shaky. And I know it just sounds crazy because when you use the word electricity, it's like a cliche, but I could close my eyes and I could feel that the whole place shaking. There was no music piped in to make it feel like it was loud. The whole place was loud, and there was almost this smoky, grainy quality to the players, and it was so exciting. It really, really was. And like I said, back when I reflected on knowing how cool it was, you definitely knew how cool it was when the Bulls were at their peak back then, and Michael was in his prime, and they were winning games, by 50 points. They were up by 30 at halftime. I mean, you were very, very conscious of this force that was part of this whole building.
Right.
Yeah.
I think in life sometimes in general, we don't always appreciate the good old days are happening right now. Sometimes.
Yeah, and
we don't get it,
No, and I mean, when the beer is trickling down, you mentioned the beer, like someone would always, at least once a game, would knock over a beer right above the press box, and it would come in a shower onto your laptop. And we had these crummy laptops then, like, I don't know, the little Radio Shack ones. Not that it would matter. And so everybody would go like that, like, you can't see me, but you like you were doing a tornado drill over your computer, like a half dozen times a game, and there was no lid to the computer. Let me just point out.
Yeah.
So you just had to throw your body on your computer a half dozen times a game.
Yeah, but you could throw acid on those Radio Shack tandies and they would still work.
Right, but always once a game too, somebody's didn't work, and then you'd hear this like cascade of F-bombs and someone throwing their computer against a wall.
Right. You mentioned the tiny locker rooms, and it leads me to this. In terms of access, especially for a guy like Jordan, who, he became this global icon, what was access like to Michael, and what was it like to deal with the team in general on a daily basis?
Yeah. Michael was, I say this without exaggeration, I think, one of the most gracious superstars of his time. And by that, I mean, he made himself incredibly accessible. After games, was almost unheard of that he would not stand up and answer every last question. He would come out, and there'd always be, a ton of people around his locker, and I'm talking about the stadium. So there was, it was hard to even breathe in there. And there'd be people from China, and there would be people from other countries where the language, English wasn't a first language, and the questions weren't super clear. And he was always very, very patient. There would be some small paper from Iowa, say, and I went to Iowa, so I'm not saying that in a disparaging way, but a tiny paper somewhere, and they would introduce themselves and ask their question. He would never, look down on them. He would answer their questions. I always admired him for that, and I think that all of us who covered him on a daily basis did admire him. In practice, they practiced at the Berto Center, which was, but before the Berto Center was an old health club, the Multiplex it was called. It's still there, and the Chicago Sky practice is there. But it was just, not a fancy schmancy health club, and they played there. And the players would have to pass us. I mean, there was no way of avoiding us after practice. So Michael would take a break every few days, and he would sort of station Scotty and Horace to go first, and then we'd crowd around them, and then he'd duck around the crowd, sometimes. But really, other than that, he stood up, and there were some hard questions, as you know, with the gambling allegations. But we'll all tell you that he stood there and answered the questions on more than one occasion, on more than not.
Was that because of who he was, or do you think he understood the role he was playing for not just himself, but for the league and the sport?
Yeah, I think there was an inherent understanding of his job. I don't know if it was because of his endorsement potential, or power rather, that he felt like he had that responsibility. If he felt his leadership on the team demanded it, I'm not sure. I think he just understood on some level that because he was who he was, that was part of it. That was just part of it. I don't know if he thought he was selling more shoes because of it. I didn't ever sense that from him. I just felt he understood it as responsibility. I think his father kept him grounded in that respect. And I didn't think he thought he could be sarcastic with us, but I never got the feeling we were the enemy. I never got the feeling he hated us. I never got the feeling that there was a disrespect between us. He understood it. And I think probably all the big stars of the day were like that. And maybe there's still, I don't cover them on a daily basis, so maybe there's still some of that. But I think there's probably more antagonism,
right
now.
Did Michael take care of the local media in terms of looking out for them? Because sometimes you will find an athlete that's famous and they're better with somebody who comes in from the outside, and on a day-to-day basis, it's not very fun.
But it sounds
like Michael was good to deal with at all times.
I'm not sure he looked out for us, but he definitely recognized and appreciated that we were the only ones on the road. Typically, Mike Mulligan from the Sun-Times and Kent McDill from the Daily Herald, the three of us were often the only Chicago reporters, print writers for sure, print reporters, on the road. And so he would take time with us. But, he loved Ahmad Rashad, and he certainly would go off with him. And, and especially come playoff time, talk to him. I think he respected the guys, why am I forgetting? Vesey, at some level. He may not have loved Peter Vesey, from New York, but he appreciated that when New York played Chicago, he knew all those guys by name. He knew all the New York reporters. He knew all the Cleveland guys, and he would take time to acknowledge. I would be surprised if any of the Cleveland or New York reporters would say like, oh yeah, he hated us or we hated him, or I don't think you'd get that. I'd be surprised.
That's interesting because, again, you get a guy that becomes a global icon, and everybody's heard about Michael's competitiveness, and you almost feel like, was he an egomaniac? Because people are always asking sports writers, right? What was he like in person? It's so contrived that you really don't know. But at the same time, you can tell if you're around him on a daily basis if this is a fraudulent pose or if this is just how the type of guy is when he deals with you.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend like every single person agrees with me. I liked him personally. I really did. I felt like he was very respectful of me as a woman. In what ways? I think when I was pregnant, let's go to the pregnant part first. He was very almost gentle with me. He like if I saw me in the middle of a crowd, he would sort of make sure I was okay, make sure that people weren't stepping on me, or make sure I was felt okay.
Like in the scrum of reporters when they're jostling around to get around him. Yeah. Yeah,
he was sort of sweetly protective like that. And I remember that very well, I didn't expect special treatment by any means, but certainly I felt like he and I had a little bit of a bond, and I'm sure the other beat writers felt like that as well, which you would hope if you're a beat writer for a major newspaper covering a team, you better have a relationship with the greatest player on the team, if not all of them, which, I felt like I did. So, if I saw him today, we'd hug and it'd be like, how's your kids? How's your kids? Like it was a work relationship. It was a respectful working relationship. And if he treated others later in his career any differently, then, I didn't know about it. But I don't think you'd find any Chicago media people would hate him who dealt with him daily because he did respect us. He really did.
You mentioned your book Transition, which was about the season when he retired to play minor league baseball. It was about the Bulls, that team, transitioning without Michael. There was a point in that book where you went down to visit him when he was a minor league baseball player. It was very poignant. What do you recall about that visit with Michael when he was down toiling in the minor leagues of baseball?
I remember how hot it was, and I worked in Florida, but that was a level of humidity that, at Birmingham, right, that was quite crazy in Alabama, so it was very hot. No, I remember that, I remember a lot of things. I remember talking to his young teammates, and they were still in awe of him, but he really, really, really wanted to be one of the guys, very much wanted to be one of the guys, and just, it's tough when you've got, like, another separate locker next to you to accommodate all your fan mail and your, huge pile of gym shoes. But he would give the shoes and cleats and whatever, he'd give them away to all of his teammates. He really, really wanted to be one of them. And I think even though they were in awe of him, they did treat him, like one of the guys. He was still trying to hit a curveball like everybody else. I remember him talking about, just coming to grips with his father's death at that time and crying in his hotel room and, getting to spend time again with him. There wasn't if there were other reporters there, I don't remember them. I remember getting time with him. I remember him, really a kind of, I don't want to say letting down his hair per se, but just really confiding in me how sad he still was, how much he mourned his father's violent death. And it was terrible. It was very, very sad. He was lonely. He was happy to be in his element, and he was thrilled to be in a baseball uniform and working on all those things. But I also got a sense he was very lonely because he was a guy who liked being around people. You know, he liked his older friends who were the security guards from the stadium. Those were his friends. You could call them his posse, but they weren't collected as a posse. They were collected as friends who were looking out for him and then became his dear, dear friends. I think he missed them. But you know, he missed his dad, and that's who I saw those few days that I visited. I saw a guy who was mourning the loss of his father.
Were you surprised when he came back to basketball?
No, I don't think any of us could be completely, just because he was so great and he left so much on the table, you know, on the court, that, you know, it was dramatic the way he did it, certainly.
By the way, you got the scoop on number 45, right? That was your scoop.
I did. I did.
He was going to come back with a different number. Tell us how you got that scoop, by the way.
Oh, gosh. Well, it was like old days, you know, journalism where you're like just sort of the only one left in the building, you know, in the Burdo Center where they're practicing. And I walked in on, again, couldn't do this, but just kind of walked into the training room and saw Johnny Ligmanowski, who was their trainer, the Bulls trainer, sewing on a 45 onto Michael's uniform and said, "Oh my gosh, like what's going on with that?" And he's like, "Oh, he's going to be number 45. And I said, "Can I write that?" And he's like, "Sure." And then I couldn't tweet it, you know, because it's 5:00 at night. So, right. So I remember calling into the office, like all excited. And this happened to me a number of times. And this is terrible to say, but there could have been a sexist quality to it at that time that they didn't believe me. I think that there were certain stories that I was not taken as seriously on back in the day that a man would have been taken seriously, would have been trusted with stories. That was one of them. I felt like nobody believed me. You know, as a young woman still, I was 30 years old, but, you know, come on, right? So they did a little teeny tiny box inside the section, which maybe that's what it deserved, that he was coming out as number 45. And I think they put it like in a late edition because they weren't quite sure. And there had been a lot of talk about it. Are you sure? Is it going to happen? And then when people doubt your word so much, you start thinking like, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he was just kidding. I don't know. But, you know, it was a big deal to be in the newspaper. That was a very, very big deal. And you couldn't undo it when it was in there. Like online, you just, you know, scrub it, right?
Yeah. So, just change it real quick.
but sure enough, and I have a 45 jersey in my house. I have a fake T-shirt one that I thought, I can get this because it might be worth something someday. Right.
Well, Michael comes back as number 45, and when he got back to the Bulls, he got back to being who he was and even better as a player, and the team got even better, if you can imagine that. And then really, did the scene change, especially when Rodman came aboard?
Sure. Well, I wasn't the beat writer for Rodman, but I was still covering the team here and there. I felt there was an element of circus quality that was unlike anything. Like they would always use the word Beatlemania to describe the early 90s pre-Rodman time, the first three-peat. And, you know, you'd go into the plaza, let's say, or wherever they stayed, and you couldn't get in the lobby, and there was a million people, but yet there was still a certain control to it. When Rodman joined, it did become more circus-like, in part because, and I think probably those who covered the beat on a daily basis had a different relationship with him and a different viewpoint, just like I did of Michael. I found Dennis to be very sort of sad and sympathetic kind of character in some ways, because he'd start crying when you talked to him. And, you know, he was clearly just all over the map, and I felt for him. But yet I did not feel for him after games when he wouldn't talk and he'd run to his car and the whole press pack would run after him. And that was, to me, the most demeaning thing. And I remember at one point I asked off of the Rodman sidebars because I was now not the beat writer. I was covering the team just as a GA until I covered the Bulls, the Bears. And so I was like, please don't make me be, you know, run. I'm not running after Dennis Rodman.
Like it was just like,
I covered this team, you know, there's something about it. I found really distasteful. It did sort of take on a life beyond what the media could get our arms around and cover. And so I resented that part of it. But I found it very interesting, watching The Last Dance, for sure. Found it fascinating and the stuff I didn't know. But at the time, I really resented that, and I didn't like what it had become. Nor did Michael, nor did, at first.
Right.
They didn't like it either.
Why was Phil the right guy for that team as a coach?
I think because he was one of them. I think he was, when he was a Knick, he was certainly this very eclectic guy. He was, marched to the beat of his own drummer. He was not someone who conformed. So he appreciated when he came that he was going to have to treat everybody a little differently, and that all these different personalities were important to figure out. He didn't have patience for the young guys. He didn't have patience for the rookies. But the older guys, he certainly, with his books and his, his transcendental meditation, all that kind of stuff, he really did try to tap into what made this team tick, and he created this incredible little bond. And you've got to have that. You've got to have that. Every championship team has this us against the world kind of feeling. Either us against the world, nobody likes us, nobody appreciates us, or nobody understands us. And I think that may have been what he had with them. He building this wall against Jerry Krause, I think endeared him that much more. He understood. He was the only one who could have gotten Michael to share the ball like he did, to play the triangle. And that was certainly hugely key. He had these two veteran assistant coaches in Johnny Bach and Tex Winter who understood him, and he allowed them to do their thing, offensively and defensively. He was very good, a very good manager of personalities and of human beings.
Mm-hmm. Which isn't easy to do when you get a group of successful, uber-talented people, egos, contracts. I'm always amazed when a professional team can keep any type of success going. You mentioned why the bitterness of Chicago fans about, it ending. Why did it end? Why do you think it ended when it did?
Well, contractually, Jerry Reinsdorf would tell you that he couldn't re-sign Phil and he couldn't re-sign Michael. And, there was contractual things that now they'll go back and be like, well, no, that wasn't the case. You didn't try hard enough, or you didn't, you walked away first, stuff like that. I think egos did get in the way at the end. I don't remember every little detail right at the moment of kind of what splintered it. But I think Jerry Krause had that famous line that, like, he could still win. I don't remember how he said it now, but, that he could still win he could still fill the guest suites without Michael. He could still win. So that ego really, really tripped them up, this thought that he could really do it without the principal players. Of course he couldn't. No way could he. And, could they have done it without Phil? Perhaps, but without Phil, the whole thing kind of crumbled, and maybe it was just meant to be, maybe it was just meant to be 6, and that was that.
Right.
But you could tell that Michael was bitter at the end of Last Dance, that, he felt like they could have kept going. Right.
I think the title that they won at home at the stadium in 92, I think that epitomizes, you have this atmosphere. It's at home. It's in this great old barn. It's electric, and yet you're sitting there trying to type on deadline while they're making this ridiculous comeback against Portland. I think they were down like 17 or something crazy. I think that epitomizes what it's like for a writer to be in the moment, but also trying to work.
I talk to my students about being on deadline like that. There's nothing better. There's nothing more fun than that rush. Because there were times when we got spoiled and we could write at halftime because they were ahead by so much. So when you got the opportunity to write, that was my most fun time. I mean, there's no substitute for that in my life that I could find that will equal that adrenaline rush of sitting over your laptop and trying to create something. with minutes, to spare. I adored that feeling, and I think I was probably better at it in some ways than other things. But yeah, I remember that championship, that was the first one at home, and, standing with my notepad in the middle of the floor and just absorbing it, and like knowing that the editors were going crazy because I was literally, on deadline.
Where's the story, Melissa?
Where is it? Yeah, and like there was no way I was gonna turn in a story of play by play. It was not going to happen. Like I needed to bring that feeling that I was experiencing to the readers, even if it was the first edition. And so I just remember like typing as these things were rushing and I was going to stand in the middle of the court and start scribbling, and then almost getting squished on the boards as the players went down to the locker room. That was in the stadium. And thinking like, well, if I get killed, that will be a hell of a story, but it won't be my story, and I would like it to be my story. So, and then, just being in the middle of that, which, again, back in the day, they would, if you were a beat writer, they'd give you a little sticker on your, maybe they still do it, on your credential that meant you could be in the locker room after the game. Mm-hmm. So there's only a few of us who could be in the locker room after that. And so we were in this teeny tiny, not even their locker room. It was like a little holding room where Phil was literally addressing them after the championship and saying, what a long, strange journey it's been. And like sort of being in it, with the champagne. And it's not fun because you're on deadline and the champagne is the worst possible pain on earth. But like later you go, wow, that was really cool. And that was worth being a minute or two late on deadline so that a couple 100,000 people could be in that huddle with you and have that feeling with you. And they didn't hate us for being with them because we were with them the whole time. So it's like, what's she doing here? Get her out of here. It was like, oh no, it's okay. She's chronicling this, So the handful of us who were there were, in no way were we part of that victory, obviously. But we were allowed to be part of that scene, and that was something I'll never forget.
Well, you being in that locker room at that moment allowed all those Chicago Bulls fans and the people in Chicago and the readers everywhere, you allowed them to be there with you and in that moment too, because you captured it. And I think that's what the heart of the job was about, was to try to, hey folks, I got this access. I'm going to take you along with me if you're willing to go. And sometimes you had moments like that where it's just historic. And,
Casey Johnson is a very talented writer from the Tribune who followed me a couple writers later covering the Bulls, and now he's with Comcast, NBC Sports, Chicago, covering the team. But he had a brilliant line once to my students. I brought him in to talk, and he said, I've always thought of myself only as the custodian of the beat, so that years from now when they unearth the time capsule, if you will, that of all the Bulls coverage, this is the block that I was the custodian of. That was my responsibility to bring this. That's it. But it's an enormous responsibility. But I think he was trying to get across to kids, like, it's not about you ever as a writer, but it's also this tremendous responsibility that when someone cracks open, however they find the Tribune stories of the early 90s, I hope that they get that feeling. I hope that they're in that locker room and on that floor, because that's what I was trying to do. And, that's all any of us could do.
Well, you did it so well for so many years all over the world. When you think about it, you're with the greatest basketball player ever. You're covering some really bad Bears teams. Oh, yeah.
Very mediocre.
But you're on the local scene, you're around the world, and you were taking everybody with you. And I think, the advice that you're now giving to students at Northwestern, they're very lucky to have somebody like you teaching them the skills and how to do this job. And I'm really thankful that you were able to provide our listeners with a chance to understand what it was like to do the job then when you did it.
Well, thanks so much, Todd. I hope that I know that there is still the same magic for the profession and still the same desire to tell the stories, and hopefully there always will be, because you can't get a computer to tell stories about what's happening, right? And so I think there will always be a place for us, right? There will always be a place for the storytellers.
Let's hope so. Melissa, Thanks a lot. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for listening to Pressbox Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcome here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Bill Huffman, and our audio engineer Nathan Corson. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
Science, science, science! Science, science! Hello, podcast fans. Want to get weird with us? Come check out the Mad Scientist Podcast. We're a weekly show that looks at the history, philosophy, and hard facts behind your biggest paranormal questions.
Did the government really pay for a psychic spy program?
Yes!
Is it true that surgery got its start in grave robbing?
Yes!
Can a roller coaster really kill you?
Legally, we can't say so for sure, but sometimes, yes! Join myself, Chris Cogswell, and my co-host, Marie Mayhew, as we examine the science, philosophy, and history behind the strange and unusual. All to discover what's possible and plausible versus what's, well, just made up. Check us out wherever you find your favorite podcasts. The Mad Scientist Podcast.